Hello, everyone. Welcome to a Chabura members shiur. Thank you, everyone, for making it out, especially with the clock change, the confusing clock change. We have with us one of our top uh, Rabbanim of the Chabura, Rabbi Yosef Zarnighian. About our speaker, Rabbi Yosef Zarnighian is the assistant rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese Kahal Kadosh Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, USA. He was born and raised in Great Neck, New York. Prior to graduating from Queens College with degrees in economics, he pursued the rabbinic path of his great-grandfather by studying under Rabbi Chaim Sabato and Rabbi Nachum E. Rabinovich, Zichron Levacha. Rabbi Zarnighian subsequently received semicha from Rabbi Sam Kassin and Rabbi Yaakov Peretz of the Shebhar Sephardic Center in Jerusalem. He serves his country as a chaplain in the U.S. Air Force Reserve and also works as a translator of medieval Sephardic Jewish texts for the Shalkot Project. Rabbi Zarnighian is no stranger to the Chabura. I highly recommend checking out his previous shiurim. With that, thank you everyone for being here live. Thank you everyone who's going to be listening afterwards. And Chacham, the floor is yours.
All right. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone with us tonight. The topic that I want to discuss is important for many reasons. First and foremost, it's important because we're going to be tackling a hakdama. Often when we are in yeshiva and we're studying various texts, be it philosophy or halacha or Parshanei HaMikra, the introduction, the hakdama, is often overlooked, and people tend to miss all of the goodies and gems that are hidden there. Not to mention the underlying context with which we have to view the text that we read. The context of these texts are often laid out in the hakdama of particularly medieval works, but certainly even contemporary works. So it's a very, very important piece of information that I always like to remind my students of and others of when we go through Hakdamot. The Hakdamah of today is the introduction of Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra. Some say Ibn Azra, but like the Mishnah in Eduyot says, Hayav Adam Lomar Bilshon Rabo. I have to say it the way I was taught, so I say Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra was perhaps one of the greatest of biblical commentators. He's not just a biblical commentator. He wrote works spanning the entire gamut of knowledge. He wrote on astronomy, astrology, not the way pseudo-intellectuals and superstitious folks like to understand the term today. Ibn Ezra believed it was a real science for reasons that I don't fully understand and I won't get into now. He wrote extensively on mathematics, on dikduk, on Hebrew grammar, and for our purposes today, on biblical commentary. His perushim span almost the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. There are some sections of the Hebrew Bible, of the Tanakh, where we do not have commentary from him, but his commentary is incredibly valuable for reasons we'll get into in one moment. He was born in Tudela, Spain. He was a real Sephardi Tahor. Born in the late 11th century. He passed away in the late 12th century. And he built quite a reputation for himself. In the Haredi world, he's often viewed as someone who is cast to the side and is not on the straight path, God forbid. These people don't know basic Jewish history. We have no greater than Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi, who writes to Ibn Ezra with immense reverence. He was also a man that deserves a great deal of appreciation because of the heartache that he had endured throughout his life. There is a saying recorded in his name, perhaps he states it directly, that if he were in the candle making business, the sun would never set. And if he were in the funeral business, the people would stop dying. Just to illustrate how difficult it was for him to make a living and to get by. And nevertheless, he persevered and continued to engage in his Torah study and to write for us. It shows you to what extent it should teach us, I should say, to what extent we should devote ourselves to the Torah as Jews, despite the heartache and hardship that we face throughout our lives. Okay, so I'm going to share the Hakdama, the text of the Hakdama that we'll be learning today. Okay. So the text that I am using is courtesy, just to give due credit, is courtesy of Ala Torah and their version of uh, alatorah.org and their version of the introduction to the Ibn Ezra. So Ibn Ezra begins, Beshem ha'el hagadol v'anorah achel lefaresh perush haTorah. We're going to notice the entire introduction is written poetically. So bear with me in interpreting his poetic style. And I also want to apologize in advance. I did lose my voice earlier this week, so if I have difficulty speaking, please let me know. If you have difficulty hearing me, please let me know. So Ibn Ezra begins by saying, in the name of the great and almighty God, I will begin to elucidate upon the Torah. Ana Elohei Avi Elohei Abraham. This is also, like every line in Ibn Ezra's introduction, he's going to borrow from various pesukim, borrowing the language of various pesukim throughout the Tanakh. So if I were to go through every single verse, that would take forever. So we'll just point out for example's sake this once, borrowing from the pasuk in Bereshit, Chaf Dalet. Please help me, O God of my father Abraham. Asa chesed im avdecha Abraham. Please grant me this chesed to your servant Abraham. And the petach tevarecha meir, may the opening of your words enlighten l'avdecha ben avdecha meir, to the servant, son of your servant Meir. Ibn Ezra's father was Meir, right? So you have a pun, Meir, Meir. Mishuat panecha tavo Ezra leven amatecha hanikra ben Ezra, and may and through the grace of your salvation, may aid and assistance come to the son of your servant, your that is also referred to as Ezra. Again, a pun on Ezra and Ezra, right? Okay, so Ze Sefer Hayashar leAvraham As'al. This is in reference to the literally translated, the straight book. The book, Sefer Bereshit is referred to as Sefer Hayashar. The Gemara refers to each one of the books of the Torah by a code name or nickname, if you will. The Gemara says, why is Sefer Hayashar, why is Bereshit called Sefer Hayashar? Because of the acts of those who were Yasharim, are taught in it. Those who were the straight examples of the Jewish people, Abraham, the Avot, the brothers, and so on and so forth. Right? Similarly, right, for example, Sefer Devarim is referred to as Mishneh Torah because it's a repetition of the whole Torah, and so on and so forth. So, Uvavatot hadiktuk nikshar, and it is bound by the ropes of grammar, literally. In other words, the commentary that I pray to God and hope to God to relate to all of you is one, among many things, one that is bound in grammar, meaning Ibn Ezra's primary focus is always going to be to ground our interpretations in light of a proper grammatical analysis. And similarly, to those who have a brain, it should be sound and fit, meaning it should not, my commentary, pray God, will not deviate from common sense. Again, borrowing from the famous pasuk, and all, so in other words, all those who rely on it will be fortunate. I hope that's a prayer and not a statement, because it could sound a little haughty, but I don't think he meant it that way. Ne'um Avraham HaSefaradi HaNizkar. So says Abraham, the Sephardi, mentioned earlier. Ibn Ezra now is going to do, after he ends off his tefillah, which was, by the way, a very common theme throughout medieval Spain. I'm sure everybody here, Harambam is very famous for his B'Shem Adonai El Olam, or like he begins in his Mishneh Torah, Az lo evosh me'abid Toratecha, if I'm quoting the pasuk correctly, that that we should always begin our works with the tefillah and to go into it thereafter. So now Ibn Ezra begins his 5 paths. He's going to outline for us a total of 5 different methods that were common in his day, broad methods, not specific methods, but broad methods of interpretation through which various factions or groups would interpret the Torah. Okay, well, 4 others and then his. Mifarshei Torah Elohim al arba'a derachim. Commentators of the Torah go about their interpretation in one of 4 ways. He begins by pointing out the first one. The first path that we will explore, aruka urchava. It would take forever to elaborate on. It is very lengthy. Unfashot anshe dorenu niskeva, and it is also beyond the comprehension of many people in our times. He's saying that about his times. You can imagine how it relates to our times then. V'im ha'emet kinguda b'toch agula, and by way of analogy, Ibn Ezra says, if you were to draw a circle, and in this circle create mark a dot, and X marks the spot. If X is truth, zot haderech bekav harachav. This is the straightest path that leads from the circle, the outer layer of the circle, to the dot. This is that's a philosophical reference to one of the theories of creation. But put simply, that is the most straightforward and commonsensical interpretation that one can offer for a pasuk. And it is upon this path that we speak that many great figures have traveled. Vehem chachmei hayshivot b'malchut Yishmaelim. And who are these great sages? They are the great sages of the Arabian kingdom, if you will. Those chachamim from North Africa, the Middle East, Spain in his time, and he gives you some examples. Rav Yitzchak shechiber shnei sefarim mibereshit ad vaychulu. Who is Rabbi Yitzchak? Rabbi Yitzchak is none other than Rabbi Yitzchak ibn Ghayat. Rabbi Yitzchak ibn Ghayat was perhaps one of the greatest Rashei Yeshivot in medieval Spain. He was, if I recall correctly, the teacher of Rabbi Yitzchak al-Fasi, the Rif, and unfortunately, it's very, very sad, we don't have too many works that remain, that were written by him. He wrote many works on halakha. The only one that was restored as of about 100 years ago or so is a work called Sha'arei Simcha. Sha'arei Simcha is a work that is written on a variety of different areas of halakha, in particular Hilchot Pesach. So if you want to learn Rabbi Yitzchak ibn Ghayat's halachot on Pesach, you can check that out. But he also wrote a commentary on the Torah that we no longer have, but Ibn Ezra had access to it. Anyway, he says, but he was so lengthy in his commentary, he never got to finishing it. Uvasuk or on the third pasuk in the Torah, Emunat Baalei Or Ba'choshech Iskir. He mentions, he being Ibn Gayat, he mentions the opinions of those who are the believers of light and dark. This is an allusion to Zoroastrian scholars. So Ibn Ezra, in case those who are not familiar with his writings may not know, Ibn Ezra has a tendency to be very critical. You can get on his bad side very quickly. And because of he does it from a place of striving towards emet, striving towards truth, as he stated earlier. So because he is so perfectionist in his method of interpretation, he can be very critical even of his predecessors, who one can argue were far greater than he. Nevertheless, he does not deviate from, he is not shy to state his opinion. So he criticizes Ibn Riyad for his citing of Zoroastrians. And he says, for Ibn Riyad, he walked in darkness but did not know it. So, not his fault. And also when Ibn Riyad talks about the comments on the pasuk, let the earth sprout vegetation. He he invented words out of thin air. Because he spoke of the trees and vegetation, ketanim ugdolim, when really the Torah says, Totzeh haaretz deshe esev mazriya zera. So what the exact comment Ibn Riyad related was, I'm not entirely sure because I don't have the text. We don't have the text. But Ibn Ezra takes issue with his more broad understanding of that pasuk. And then he goes on to say that regarding the creation of living beings, he cites Chochmot Nochriot, and he even criticizes Rabbi Saadia Gaon, the great Rabbi Saadia Gaon. Ibn Ezra says he tends to do the same thing, especially with regard to the creation of the luminaries. Ichnis teot acherot ladat midot haniskarot al kol perush al perush chachmei hasefirot. He cites the view of astronomers to calculate precise measurements and distances and measurements, and this Ibn Ezra takes issue with because the citations that Saadia Gaon had used, the citations that Ibn Riyad had used, were borrowed from foreign sources. Now, I want to just pause briefly. What are foreign sources? Ibn Ezra is no stranger to foreign sources, i.e., books of science and mathematics and astronomy from his fellow Muslim colleagues or even Christian colleagues. Just because somebody is not Jewish doesn't mean they don't have Chokhmah to offer. But what Ibn Ezra is referring to over here is not about that. He's referring to the famous Gemara and Megillah. It's a Gemara that many of us are familiar with. Chokhmah bagoyim ta'amin. If you find wisdom among the nations of the world, in the secular realm, then you could believe them. We critically evaluate the wisdom of our non-Jewish brothers and sisters. Torah bagoyim, the Gemara says, al ta'amin. But if you begin referring to our non-Jewish brothers and sisters in their biblical or halachic points of reference, and those sort of works commenting on Torah or on halakha, al ta'amin. You don't believe such a person if they say they exist, meaning we don't view that as binding upon us. And so Ibn Ezra is applying the same principles to use such works for interpreting Pesukim. He says we have to interpret the Pesukim of the Torah in light of our tradition and our tradition only, the tradition of the Chachamim, popularly coined Chazal, however you want to phrase it. Gam Rav Shmuel ben Chofni. Shmuel ben Chofni Gaon was one of the earliest Mefarshim on the Torah. His Perush on the Torah is out of print, but it has been printed by Mossad Rav Kook. It's actually a very valuable Perush. It's cited extensively by all those who came after him. So Rav Shmuel ben Chofni, Asaruach bechofnav, is a pun on his name. He dissed him using his own name. He also gathered nothingness in his clutches. And he goes on to give various examples from his commentary on Bereshit. He elaborates on the symbolic significance of the various travels of the Avot, of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. And he says, there's no benefit in elaborating on random travels of the Avot. You're reading into it too much, nothing to read about. And then he goes to not only to criticize Rav Shmuel ben Chofni, but to criticize many other Geonim. If somebody wants to truly understand the secular sources that they quote, let him learn them from the direct sources of those who are wise, meaning don't rely on these rabbis to teach it to you. Go learn it yourself because they didn't understand it properly. Then he will understand through seeing these works if they are in fact correct. The Geonim cited these works, the secular works of their contemporaries, without actually seeing them inside. They heard of these sources that they cite secondhand, maybe third hand, but they never bothered to look up the sources, he says. And there were even those who, among the Geonim, who did not understand the methodology of these secular scholars, and how they brought about, how they arrived at the conclusions that they did. So, very sharp criticism from Ibn Ezra. No one is immune. And the main takeaway from the first path of interpretation is to be very careful when you're citing sources that A, you are not familiar with, and two, that you have not studied yourself. If you cannot properly assess the material, and if you don't know from where the material is being derived, don't bother. Don't pretend to be an expert in something you are not. So, another thing that we should note from the first method of interpretation is that Ibn Ezra had at his disposal many mefarshim that we no longer have. And in that sense, Ibn Ezra's commentary serves as a priceless archive. It's an archive of material where the Geonim, perhaps only commentary of its kind that does this, where he quotes secular scholars, he quotes the Geonim, he quotes, as we're going to see, Karaites, he quotes Muslim scholars, the list goes on. So it's a treasure trove, if you will, of commentary that you really won't find anywhere else. Okay, V'aderech hashenit. Now, the second method, Baharua Petaltolim, the crooked ones. By the way, that's where the word Naphtali comes from. The name Naphtali comes from Petaltol, like to wrestle with, to move around in all different directions. V'im hem Israelim, he says, even though these crooked people are Jews, Asher chashvu ki amdu al nekuda be'atzma, who believe that, forget the fact that they think they're near the truth. They believe they've arrived at the truth, very, very sure of themselves. V'im hem lo yadu'u et mekoma. But the truth is, not only have they not discovered the truth, they don't even know where to find it in the first place. Vezot derech hatzedukin. This is the way of the Karaites. Ibn Ezra's number one enemy in his commentary are the Karaites. He hates the Karaites, really, really doesn't like them. They were a force to deal with in medieval Spain, and ultimately they made their way further east, remaining hundreds of years later in Lithuania and Crimea. But a lot of Jews were swayed by the arguments that the Karaites made, excuse me. So he felt the need to combat them. So who are these Karaites? They are like Anan, and that's Anan ben David. He was the old school godfather of the Karaite movement. Ironically, he was the least Karaite-like. He was the least literal among the Karaites in his method of interpretation. But I'm not going to get into that now. Binyamin is Binyamin al-Nahawandi of Persia. Then Mashiach. No, don't get carried away. Not actually Mashiach, but Ben Mashiach was also another Karaite scholar, Hassan ben Mashiach from Baghdad, and Yeshua, not Jesus, but Yeshua. The Karaites tend to have very strange names, by the way. So typically, if you see names like Bilam and Yeshua, and names that you don't typically associate with Jews, they were probably Karaite if they were from the medieval period. At any rate, so yeah, Yeshua ben Yehuda, who was one of the famous Karaites of Yerushalayim. So these Karaites were famous for their works on Karaite law and interpretation, and he mentions them by name. I have two theories as to why he mentions them by name. Either because they had the most widespread prominence in the Karaite world, or because they are among the Karaites that Ibn Ezra never bothers to deal with. There are other Karaites. Ibn Ezra's most famous love-hate relationship is his relationship with Yefet ibn Ali. Yefet ibn Ali was a Levi, actually. He was from, I think, Basra in Iraq. And many of his commentaries, by the way, they're so beautiful that they're being brought back to light by Bar-Ilan University Press, translated from the from the Arabic. And Ibn Ezra often cites him favorably and often cites him with contempt. So interesting relationship. Okay. At any rate, as well as any other sectarian that does not adhere to the Matikeh Hadat. Ibn Ezra's term for Chachamim are Matikeh Hadat, the coiners or the transmitters of the law, if you want to translate it literally. And their tendency is to either bear far to the left or far to the right, or make the left right and the right left. In other words, they lack direction. They don't have canons of interpretation the way the rabbinites, the way our tradition, our chachamim have transmitted to us. It's kind of a free-for-all, basically. And therefore, each commentator will explain the pesukim according to their whim. They'll even do that with the mitzvot. Can you imagine? They'll interpret Pesach however they like, Shavuot however they like, Kashrut, Shabbat, you name it. And they're also ignorant of grammar. They want to be literalists. They're not even good at their own jobs. Therefore, they even stray in the diktuk because they don't know. They're so anti-rules, they even hate the rules of grammar. So they mess up there too. Ve'ech yaskimu b'mitzvot al da'atam. Now Ibn Ezra tackles the consequences of their method. He says, how is it possible to arrive at practical execution of the mitzvot according to their interpretation? Because there is no decisiveness. The mitzvot, according to them, can change in the parameters at any time. Because you will never find in the Torah a single mitzvah that is fully elucidated upon according to all of its parameters. And he's right. Go study the parasha next week. Go study the parasha the week after. God willing, we'll continue with Sefer Vayikra. You will not be able to execute even a single mitzvah of the Torah in its entirety without ambiguity, that is, because the Torah doesn't do that for you. The very nature of the Torah requires a human endeavor, which is that of interpretation. Interpretation, according to Ibn Ezra, must be regulated, definite, and transmitted. All of these criteria are missed by the Karaite. I'll mention one. It's a very big one if you know what I'm talking about, he says. Because we all know the punishment for it is karet if you eat on Yom Kippur. Nobody wants to eat on Kippur. But how do you calculate when Kippur is? What is considered food? What is considered drink? Do kids count? Do sick people have to also fast in the same way healthy people do? What if a person's going to die? The Torah doesn't talk about any of these things. As well as chametz on Pesach, and regarding that which the pure did not do in reference to Korban Pesach, do you bring it in a state of Tumah if there's no other option? What about chametz? What is chametz? Does that include vinegar? The Karaites think so. Ushvitat Yamim Shiva, as well as the 7 days where there's no melacha done. Those are, of course, Rosh Hashanah, Kippur, the 2 days of Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot, and Shemini Chag Aseret. And he gives you many other examples, right? Yom Teruah. What's Yom Teruah? Shofar is never mentioned in the Torah explicitly. And then Ibn Ezra goes on to bash the Karaites regarding their interpretation of the calendar. The Aniyei Da'at Merudim, these rebellious, stupid people, Samu Ototami Pasuk, they base their calendar from the 14th Pasuk in the Torah. The Torah says about the celestial creations of God, right? The sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, all that stuff. They shall serve as signs and set times and for days and years. Well, Ibn Ezra has a problem with that. These people, these Karaites did not realize ki hayu, the language of, let's go back. Vehayu leototu muadim, right? Hayu is what? Hayu is in reference to plural objects, more than one. They didn't realize that hayu lashon rabim, it's rabim, al hameorot ve'al kochavim. It's in reference to the sun, the moon, and the stars. In other words, the Torah from this pasuk does not tell you which of the celestial entities, which of the celestial bodies serve as the luminary for calculating years or months. There is no explicit mention of that. Maybe we calculate our calendars using the stars as well. right? It's a plausible reading of the pasuk if this is your source. Ibn Ezra goes on to talk about some grammatical points regarding how we could understand these pesukim. I'm going to skip that for time's sake, so we can move on to other points. But I will point out on a final note here regarding this tangent of Ibn Ezra, "Va'asher amaru ki hadavar talui al mare enayim naseu." Those who say that the calculation of the months depends on nothing but the mere sight of the moon. We're assuming it's the moon because that's one of the tangents he got into, but let's assume that. Or perhaps it's on something else, seeing something else. Well, what happens if you don't see that thing? Borrowing from the famous pasuk in Yirmiyah and later in Hallel, like we read today, they have eyes but do not see. Ulai Yiranu batorah makom sham zot. Perhaps they saw this cited somewhere in the Torah, and it was lost, and they found the place where it was lost, and we did not. He's being facetious, of course. It does not state explicitly in the parasha relating to the various offerings that are brought throughout the Jewish calendar. You cannot bring these offerings as the Torah describes for the various holidays and Rosh Chodesh and so on and so forth, because it doesn't ever mention the moon. The moon is never mentioned as a determining factor. It's only, the Torah only outlines the, for lack of better terms, abstract dates. So days on the calendar are mentioned. We know what days to bring them on. But where the starting point and where the end point of those months are is never made clear to us. As well as Shabbat b'Shabbato. That's in reference to the Korban Olah that's brought on the Shabbat. Even Shabbat itself, if you really want to be literal about it, is not something that you could determine from the Torah itself. Because Shabbat, we'll say, is on the seventh day. How do you calculate the seventh day? Do you count from sunrise or do you count from sunset like we do? Okay. I'm going to move on a little further to get to some other points. ועוד מי סיפר לנו כי ימי החודש עד 30 ספורים, who told us that months have the designated quantity of 30 days or 29 days. And he criticizes a Persian Karaite whose name was Yehuda Parsi. Yehuda Parsi wrote a whole book trying to prove these things from the text of the Torah itself, but he says it's futile and I can refute it as I have in other works of mine. He then goes on to criticize Karaites for their interpretation of declaring Rosh Hashanah. Karaites celebrate Rosh Hashanah on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. The Karaites are half right. It is Rosh Hashanah, but it's not the Rosh Hashanah of humanity, according to our tradition. It's the Rosh Hashanah of the calendar, but not of human assessment. So he says, let's say we have a famine going on in Israel and in the surrounding areas, and there's no vegetation to sprout, even though it's spring, right? You'll remember the Karaites talk about Rosh Hashanah in terms of Aviv. Aviv is the springing of barley, as the pasuk says, Ki seora aviv, va'pishta giv'ol. And the Torah refers to what as Chodesh Aviv? Nisan. Ki v'chodesh Aviv yatzata mimitzrayim, the Torah says. Therefore, some of the Karaites tried to look for the barley harvest, the barley, the sprouting of barley as the source for declaring their new Rosh Hashanah. But if there's a famine, or I don't know, let's say you don't live near barley, then what do you do? Do we have a leap year? You know, what do you do? What's the procedure? Do we just skip counting? Gam en sfira is nisveret. We don't even bother counting because there would be no way to determine what the new year would be if you don't have a count on the barley. Ve'en hag shekeranuhu atzeret, and there would be no holiday that we can call atzeret, Shavuot. There's no way to count any further from Pesach to Shavuot based on the Torah's commandment to us to begin counting till we reach that point. The bottom line over here is V'chol ele hamitzvot tzarichin kabbalah u'masoret. All of these mitzvot, even if you want to be a literalist, require for you to have what we would say in English, jurisprudence. You need to have jurisprudential tradition and teaching if you want to execute the Torah as it is related to us. Otherwise, the mitzvot become unexecutable. Last point before I'll take questions is a beautiful tangent that Ibn Ezra goes on, which is that of Pesach Chizkiyahu. Pesach Chizkiyahu is an episode related in Divrei Hayamim where Chizkiyah HaMelech pushes off Pesach. So imagine this. You have the month that is supposed to be Nisan turned into Adar Sheni. According to the calculation of the Bet Din, it is not supposed to be made Adar Sheni, but Chizkiyah HaMelech decides to push this agenda because at the time he was rededicating and purifying the Bet HaMikdash, and he wanted Bnei Israel to be in a state of Tahara and for the Mikdash to be in a state of Tahara so that the people could bring the Pesach properly. That gives him 1 month extra of time that he bought so that the nation can be ready to offer Pesach. Now, having said that, it wasn't supposed to be made into a Shana Me'uberet. You weren't supposed to have 2 Adars. So what Chizkiyah ended up doing is having a full-blown weekday, regular day of the week with chametz and all of that on what was supposed to be Pesach. And in what was supposed to be the month of Iyar, he made Nisan. So basically, he pushed off Pesach, quote-unquote, artificially. And I'll get to this in a second. There's a big debate as to whether or not Chizkiyah HaMelech acted properly. Upesach Chizkiyahu yahzik yedei emunah. You true believers, look to Chizkiyah HaMelech, and that will prove our tradition. Ki ne'esa al yedei etza vezikna. The leap year made that year of Chizkiyah's reign was done with proper counsel and with the elders. He didn't offer the Pesach during its set time in the Torah. The Torah says to do it in Nisan. Chizkiyah didn't do it in Nisan. He added a month. He even went as far as to lishloach yad in biblical Hebrew means to cross the line you're not supposed to. So he even crossed the line of eating chametz on Pesach. Pesach sheni karishon shivat yamim asa. And so he made Pesach sheni exactly like Pesach Rishon. Basically, yeah, as I explained earlier. ויש ראיות רבות שקיבל מעשיו רם ונישא. And many proofs that God agreed with what he did. Why? כי בבית דין היה. Because he did so with the approval of the court. ואין ברוחו רמייה. He didn't do this to fool anyone. Very, very important point that he's making over here. Harambam in Hilchot Biyat HaMikdash Perek Dalet does not agree with Ibn Ezra. He's of the opinion, there are different, Harambam uses various Gemarot to support himself, but he says that when Chizkiah created a leap year in Adar Sheni during his reign, he says that this was done shelo kahalacha. He did this unlawfully, and he basically ended up asking God for forgiveness. Uvikesh rachamim al atzmo v'al hachachamim shehiskimu, excuse me, shehiskimu al ma'asav, and he also asked mechila from God that God should forgive him for the chachamim that joined him in this decision. Evidently, there were chachamim who did not follow Chizkiah HaMelech's proposal and were against it. So there's a question as to whether or not that was even the right thing to do in the first place. But that is not Ibn Ezra's position. Ibn Ezra's position is that not only did Chizkiah HaMelech do the right thing, it was intended to be the shining example of what it means to follow the Ma'atikeh Hadat, the minters of the law. We'll cover the third path very quickly. I apologize as this has taken longer than expected, but there's so much to unpack here, so much to unpack. So the third path, he says, derech choshech va'afela. It's a path of darkness, dear God. V'hi michutz lakav ha'agula. It's not even in the circle. So if you're trying to get to the truth, okay, remember the analogy, and you could be close to it if you're in the circle. He says, this path, forget about it. It's not even in the circle. Forget the truth. They are the ones that fabricate everything containing some hidden meaning. What's their belief? All of the laws, all of the procedures of the Torah, the mitzvot are all riddles. I'm not even going to bother dealing with them. Pasuk from Tehillim. They are a nation of misguided hearts. Because words, when interpreted faithfully, are not in disunity with one another. In other words, every pasuk has its straightforward interpretation, and that straightforward interpretation should make sense enough for us to interpret it without attributing allegory to it. Again, that's a general rule. Sometimes there are pesukim that must be interpreted allegorically, but that's a point that we're going to get to, God willing, next week. But these allegorists are correct in one thing. I'll give them credit for one thing. Every mitzvah, no matter how great or small, must be weighed by our judgment. Because within the heart of mankind, there is this proclivity towards resolving things in a way that will make them sit well with us. It's a fancy way of saying human beings have a tendency to interpret texts in a way that they can comprehend. And we're quite crafty at that, at resolving problems, problem solving. And so what happens if you're reading a pasuk and you're breaking your head over it? You can't make heads or tails out of what's being said. So when that occurs, Ibn Ezra says, O yashchit asher behargashot yitbar, you can do away with that interpretation in light of that which the common senses make clear. Or, excuse me, sorry. Or alternatively, he says, what happens if a pasuk implies something to us that goes against our clear senses? Sorry. Ibn Ezra says, in that case, az nevakesh lo sod, then we can attribute some hidden meaning to it. Ki shikul hadat hu hayesod, because the main pillar of Jewish interpretation of the Torah is shikul hadat, weighing things subjectively, case by case, and commonsensically. Below, underline this. If you have to take away anything that I shared with you today, please take this line away. The Torah was not given to brainless people. The mediator between us and God is the sechel. You have to use your brain when you learn. If you just write things off as mysteries and secrets, and by the way, this is a very common thing among Orthodox Christians. In the Orthodox Christian tradition, perhaps Ibn Ezra is alluding to this. They often attribute many pesukim to mystery. We don't know what it means. It's a hidden meaning, or they will certainly treat the mitzvot allegorically. That's why they don't keep the mitzvot, right? And if logic goes against something that a pasuk relates to us, kifshuto umishpato nefarashenu v'na'amidenu al matkunto v'na'amin kikacha amito. And if something goes against the straightforward meaning of the pasuk, again, as long as it's not something that's against the laws of physics as we know it, then we explain the pasuk according to its straightforward, commonsensical meaning, and v'namideu al matkunto, and we will place it in its right fixture, meaning we're not just going to arbitrarily or haphazardly offer literal or what we would call surface level plain interpretation, but we will fit it within its context. We will also apply the correct context to the pasuk. And regarding what our belief of the pasuk's meaning shall be, that's what it shall be. Let us not go after the walls and feel them like blind people. Because we've already elaborated upon that which we needed to in sufficient manner. Why should we turn things which are staring us in the face into hidden things? There's no need to do that. And then he goes on to say there are some exceptions to the rule, like the kemilat besar ve'orlat levavchem, right? So when the Torah tells us umaltem et orlat levavchem, it's obviously not telling you to do open heart surgery on yourself. It's referring to the allegory of the foreskin of the heart. Don't be so haughty. You can circumcise your hearts and be open. Or when the Torah talks about arim gedolot uvtzurot bashamayim, like the Gemara talks about, the inhabitants of Canaan have built these great cities and fortified cities that reach the heavens. Obviously, they didn't build skyscrapers that reach satellite ships in space. It's a figure of speech. So Ibn Ezra says there are some exceptions to this rule, but everything is context dependent. A critical eye and a careful eye that follows the tradition of our Chachamim will know when to spot what. And he says the same thing applies to Etz Hadat in Parashat Bereshit, except that's a little different. he says you can interpret that to be literal and also have a hidden meaning. Just like he says, you have a lashon, you have raglaim, you have nostrils. You have two nostrils because your nostrils are capable of doing more than one thing at once, right? You have 2 feet, 2 hands because you can multitask. He says the Torah is no different. The Torah sometimes can also offer can offer one word to be interpreted in more than one way. So next time you're reading a pasuk and you're debating at the Shabbat table the correct meaning of a story or a passage, just remember it could very well be there's only one right answer, but more often than not, especially when it's not relevant to halacha, there are multiple plausible methods of interpretation. God willing, we will continue with Haderech HaRevi'it next time. But I want to leave the floor to questions while we still have some time. Bechavod.
Thank you, Chacham, for that amazing presentation. Everyone who has a question, comment, feel free to unmute, to write in the chat box. Raise your hand. I'll start off by asking how much, so there's some authors that when they write, and academians like to push this a lot, is they'll say they're only saying this because of the responding to certain things. So let's say if there's a strong threat from the Karaites, so they would say take certain positions, even if it doesn't reflect their true positions, or they'll overstate something. So do we see the Ibn Ezra doing that in his writings, or did he actually that was his position and he just sort of militarized it against the Karaites?
So when it comes to polemics, I think it's important to look at the surroundings of the author and to see if duress was ever a factor in their lives. The best example I like to give of this is Ramban. Ramban in his Vikuach, there's no question because it's explicitly in there, was under duress. So in the famous disputation of Barcelona, there's no question that Ramban definitely made some arguments that did not hold true in his other writings because he was under duress. One example that comes to mind is his stance on how much weight do we ascribe to Agadot, the allegorical portions of the Talmud and the Midrashim. In the Vikuach, Ramban is very dismissive of them, something that he almost never does in his commentary to the Torah. So, do we see that in Ibn Ezra's writings, though? I don't believe so. I think his polemical interpretations on various pesukim and mitzvot were in fact his. And like you, I think you said it quite well. He was zealous and militant almost about it because he had an agenda, and his agenda was to ensure that the Jewish community is not totally led astray by this newfound in fashion group. You have to remember that the Karaites, you see, they can't claim something that we claim, which is ironically tradition. They were a relatively new movement. Even though you have in the Second Temple period the Sadokim that had literalist tendencies in their interpretation, but they were theologically, dogmatically not fully aligned with the Karaites. The Karaites are really their own movement. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Anyone else? You mentioned in the beginning that he was in the Ibn Ezra today, at least, is not as is sort of sidelined a little bit, unfortunately, in the world of Torah today. Was that the case when during his life?
So to the contrary, in his own lifetime, Ibn Ezra seemed to have the respect of those who came after him, and certainly the respect of uh, his contemporaries. I mentioned Rabbi Tam as one example, with whom he corresponded, and those who are not familiar, you can Google this after the lecture. He exchanged poetry with Rabbeinu Tam, and he politely told him, you Frenchies, you don't know how to deal in poetry like us Sephardim do. Go back to your Talmud, go back to your studies of Gemara and Tosafot, leave the poetry to us. And Rabbeinu Tam was offended. He really wanted to prove himself, so he wrote back an even more beautiful poem. This correspondence is still, we still have records of it, but he definitely did receive criticism, no question about it. His most famous critic is none other than Ramban. Ramban loves ripping Ibn Ezra apart, left and right in his Perush al Torah, but he quotes him with immense reverence. Even in the few instances that I can think of, even when he thinks Ibn Ezra is borderline heretical. He does not hold Ibn Ezra outside the realm of what we would call the Jewish community, the Jewish sphere of Chachamim. He's still within that. He's still within that sphere, and he was, for lack of better terms, out of the box compared to many of his colleagues. I don't like using that term because the truth is he really was just he was loyal to tradition, but in light of those canons, those principles that our Chachamim taught us, he was very, very independent and original in his way of thinking. So that's why you have one factor why he's not really beloved by the more, I don't like using labels, the more right-wing stream of Judaism, we'll say. The other reason is because he quotes heretics. He quotes Karaites. He quotes people from all across the spectrum. But again, that falls within his system of belief, which is that of accepting, even before Harambam stated it, accept the truth from he who states it. So Ibn Ezra tends to do that quite frequently, and that's not fashionable in some circles of the Orthodox world nowadays. So take it or leave it.
Yeah. And last question, if no one has any, is did he only write in Hebrew, or was there writings he wrote in Arabic?
Ooh, that is a good question. I believe some of his secular works were written in Judeo-Arabic. The overwhelming majority of his works were written in Hebrew, in a very beautiful but cryptic Hebrew, I might add. So that's why learning Ibn Ezra can be challenging from time to time. It's also why there are many super commentaries on Ibn Ezra. A lot of people don't know that. People know about Gur Aryeh and Akedat Yitzchak and all these other super commentaries on Rashi, but they don't know about Ibn Ezra super commentaries. That is, by the way, in part why his works were better preserved compared to other works from medieval Arabic-speaking Spain. The Hebrew language always endures, but Arabic, not to the same extent. Unfortunately, it's not a good thing, but that's the reality.
Right. Okay. I shared in the chat box the conversation you mentioned with Ibn Ezra and Rabbeinu Tam, as stated by Rav Ovadia, a humorous presentation of it. So everyone can feel free. With
Thank
that,
you
we'll
for sharing.
close it for tonight, and we're excited to have you on for next week for the fourth highlight over here. Thank you everyone for coming. I see some people came in. I think you were mistaken with the time time switch. Hopefully next week either it'll set up or we'll be more clear on that. Okay, that was everyone. Thank you so much, Chacham.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone.